Vienna is a city that rarely lets its grand buildings vanish without leaving a trace. The Hofburg still anchors the old imperial centre. Schönbrunn still sits like a statement at the edge of the city. Even lesser palaces tend to survive as museums, ministries, hotels, or quiet headquarters with brass plaques. But on Prinz Eugenstrasse, a broad avenue not far from the Belvedere, there was once an estate so imposing that it felt like a private court within the capital of an empire, and it is gone. Not fallen into romantic ruin, not cordoned off as a relic, but removed so thoroughly that many people pass the address today with no sense of what stood there. The building was known as the Palais Albert Rothschild. It rose in the late 19th century, commissioned by Baron Albert von Rothschild, and designed by the French architect Gabriel Hippolyte Destailleur, a name associated with aristocratic taste and French Renaissance revival. Completed in the 1880s, the palace was unlike most Viennese townhouses in its posture. It did not press its face to the sidewalk in easy conversation with the street. It sat back, protected behind a courtyard and ironwork, arranged like a secluded hôtel particulier, brought to Vienna, and scaled up to match the confidence of a family that had become indispensable to the Habsburg economy. The message was not only wealth, it was permanence. A dynasty without a throne, building a residence that could stand beside dynasties with crowns. In the Vienna of the Ringstrasse era, architecture was not simply shelter, it was a language. Titles mattered, but the modern city increasingly ran on capital, industry, railways, and credit. The Rothschilds, through banking and finance, became an institution in their own right, close enough to power to shape it, distant enough to remain a convenient target for rumor. Their palaces in Vienna were multiple, owned by different members of the family, forming a constellation of addresses that signaled both integration and separation. Even the fact that there were several Palais Rothschild in one city hints at the scale of their presence. Inside the Palais Albert Rothschild, the logic of the rooms followed a pattern familiar to European high society. Spaces for receiving, spaces for display, and spaces carefully kept private. Yet what distinguished this house was how its aesthetic authority became a kind of shield. Collections were not decoration, they were evidence. Art, furniture, musical instruments, and decorative objects created a narrative that the family belonged in Vienna, not merely as outsiders with money, but as curators of the same heritage that older nobles claimed by ancestry. The palace became, in effect, a cabinet of Europe, a place where taste functioned like legitimacy. And still, for all its grandeur, the estate carried an odd tension. It was built to endure, but it was also built in an era when political currents were becoming harsher. By the early 20th century, Vienna was a city of brilliance and fracture. The empire that had held together so many peoples was under strain. Anti-Semitism existed in polite society and in politics, sometimes explicit, sometimes disguised as cultural anxiety. For a Jewish family whose visibility was amplified by wealth, the palace could be admired and resented at the same time. A building meant to be a fortress of belonging could also become a map for envy. The most haunting irony is that the estate's very seclusion, the set-back courtyard, the fenced boundary, now reads like a premonition. A home that kept the street at a distance was not necessarily hiding, but it was preparing. When power shifts, the first sign is not always violence. Sometimes it's the way a city's mood changes around an address. A whisper that grows louder, a polite invitation that stops arriving, a newspaper tone that sharpens. The palace still stands, but the city's relationship to it begins to turn. It is easy, looking backward, to treat this as inevitable. It wasn't. The palace existed in a Vienna that believed itself stable, cultured, and central to Europe. The family that built it believed in continuity, that influence could be secured by institutions, philanthropy, taste, and the quiet maintenance of relationships. The Rothschilds were ennobled in the 19th century. They were part of the structure of the empire, even if they were never fully embraced by its old prejudices. The palace was a wager that stone could outlast the moods of politics. And for decades, It did. It hosted a world that moved between salons and ministries, between art markets and official receptions. It held objects that had been gathered with the kind of patience only long security allows. It was, in every practical sense, a dynastic estate. Then, in 1938, the wager collapsed. Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany, and what had been a privileged address became a target with a paper trail. The story of the Vienna Rothschilds in that year is not a story of sudden confusion. It is a story of deliberate seizure. Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild, Albert's son, was arrested by the Gestapo and held as a hostage in a scheme of extortion that treated a person as leverage for a fortune. The palace, meanwhile, was not simply entered, it was processed. Jewish property was plundered and confiscated across Vienna, and the Rothschild holdings were among the most visible prizes. This is where the estate's mystery begins to feel physical, almost like a sound in an empty corridor. A palace is not just walls, it is the arrangement of objects that give those walls meaning. When those objects are removed, room by room, the building remains, but the life vanishes. Inventories can list what was taken, but they cannot restore what it felt like when the house was intact, when the rooms still belonged to the people who built them. In later decades, scholars and provenance researchers would reconstruct parts of this story through documents, restitution claims, and museum records, because the Rothschild collections became central examples in Austria's long and painful reckoning with Nazi-era theft. But the estate itself, its atmosphere, its private spaces, its everyday rhythms, was already slipping into a different category of history. Not the kind you can walk through, but the kind you have to imagine from fragments. On Prinz Eugenstrasse, Vienna still has another Rothschild palace standing at number 26, today used as the Brazilian embassy, a surviving witness to what the family once built there. But the larger palace at 20 to 22, the one meant to be a lasting seat, was now caught in the machinery of a state that did not merely want the family's wealth. It wanted their erasure, and that is the first cliff edge in this story. The moment when a dynastic estate becomes an asset to be stripped, and when survival depends not on architecture, but on whether the people inside the history can get out of it alive. When the Nazis took control of Vienna in 1938, the city did not have to be reinvented to accommodate theft. It already had the addresses, the registries, the social knowledge of who owned what, and the old resentments that made confiscation easier to justify. The Rothschild palaces were famous enough that they functioned like landmarks, and that fame became a kind of vulnerability. A house that everyone knows is not only admired, it is watched. And once the state decides it has the right to seize property, a well-known palace is simply a large, convenient container of value. The center of the Viennese Rothschild story in these years is Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild. His arrest by the Gestapo and detention as leverage for the family fortune is documented as part of the broader pattern of extortion and Aryanization that turned Jewish lives into bargaining chips. Accounts describe him effectively being ransomed, his freedom tied to the surrender of assets and control. In Vienna, that meant not only bank accounts and businesses, but residences and collections. The palace was not simply looted by opportunists, it was subjected to a system. To understand what that system did to the Palais Albert Rothschild, it helps to picture the building not as a single space, but as layers. There were formal reception rooms designed for diplomacy and display. There were galleries and salons, where art and furniture established a lineage of taste. There were service corridors, storage rooms, hidden logistics that made the elegance possible. When confiscation begins, it moves differently through each layer. The public spaces are assessed first, because they hold the obvious trophies. The private rooms follow, because they hold the intimate objects that can be sold. The service spaces come last, because they contain the practical evidence of daily life. By the time a palace is empty, it has not only lost value, it has lost identity. Provenance work and restitution records show how the Rothschild collections became entangled with Austrian museums and state holdings, and how objects circulated through Nazi-era channels that mixed scholarship with theft. This is one of the most chilling aspects of the story, the way cultural expertise can be used to legitimize removal. A painting can be described in careful art historical terms while being stolen. A cabinet can be measured and catalogued while being taken from the room it was meant to anchor. Theft, in this context, wore gloves. The palace itself became an address without its owners. And there is a particular violence in that transformation that doesn't require broken windows. A confiscated house is a message to the city. Ownership is conditional. Citizenship is conditional. Safety is conditional. Once a family like the Rothschilds could be stripped, no one needed to ask whether the rules were permanent. The rules were whatever power said they were. During the war, Vienna's cultural landscape shifted under pressure. Institutions benefited from forced transfers. Dealers operated within the new order. Some objects disappeared into private hands. Others were earmarked for planned collections and displays. Researchers later traced portions of this movement, but what is most difficult to trace is the moment-to-moment reality inside the palace during and after the seizure. Who decided what was removed first? Which rooms were left bare? What happened to the things that were too large, too unfashionable, too inconvenient to move? Those questions are where the estate's mystery lives, not in supernatural secrets, but in the gaps left by administration.
There is also a second layer of tension, the building's survival as architecture. The palace did not necessarily suffer the kind of catastrophic structural destruction that turns a residence into a ruin. In fact, records emphasize that the building still stood after the war, and that Louis, returning to Vienna in 1947, found it standing and functional, even if altered and diminished. That detail matters because it removes the easy explanation. The palace did not disappear because it was reduced to rubble in 1945. It disappeared because, after the war, choices were made. Those choices unfolded in a Vienna that had to rebuild while also dealing with restitution. Restitution, in practice, is not a single act. It is a sequence of negotiations, documents, and political decisions, often constrained by what institutions are willing to give back. The Rothschild case became emblematic in Austria, not only because so much was taken, but because restitution and the debate over it lasted decades, involving advisory boards and government policy, with major returns recommended from 1999 onward in some instances. And here, the story sharpens again. Even when stolen property is returned, the return can be conditional. Reports on the Viennese Rothschilds describe how, after the war, export permissions for returned works could be tied to donations to Austrian museums, creating a coercive dynamic that felt like a second dispossession, legal pressure replacing overt theft. This is the kind of detail that turns history from a clean moral narrative into something more corrosive, a city trying to restore justice while still benefiting from what it took. So the palace stood in post-war Vienna as a complicated object. It was private property, but it was also a symbol of everything the city wanted to move past. It represented Jewish success and Jewish victimization. It represented the sophistication Vienna prided itself on, and the brutality that sophistication had failed to prevent. Preserving such a building would have meant preserving a question in stone. What happened here, and why did the city allow it? By the early 1950s, that question was becoming harder to keep in view. Vienna was modernizing. Land was valuable. The old world was being repurposed, and the Palais Albert Rothschild, still standing, now faced a fate that would make the story of its seizure feel almost like a prologue. Because the most permanent form of erasure was not what happened in 1938. It was what happened after, when the war was over and the city had the chance to decide what to do with the building that remained. In most European capitals, a palace survives because it can always be repurposed. It becomes a museum, an embassy, a ministry, a hotel. Even when interiors are stripped, stone tends to outlast politics. That is why the disappearance of the Palais Albert Rothschild is so unsettling. This was not a building erased by wartime fire alone.
It stood after the fighting ended. It existed long enough for its owner, Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild, to return to Vienna in the post-war years and see that the structure remained. And then, in 1954, it was demolished. The year matters because it lands in an uneasy gap. It is late enough that the war cannot be blamed as the direct cause, and early enough that a wider reckoning with Nazi-era theft had not yet reshaped public life. In that interval, Vienna was focused on rebuilding, stabilizing, and modernizing. The city needed housing, offices, and infrastructure. Land was valuable, and the post-war mood leaned toward clearing away what felt like the heavy residue of a shattered era. Yet the Palais Albert Rothschild was not simply old. It was charged. Its walls had become inseparable from the story of confiscation, extortion, and displacement that accompanied the annexation in 1938. Keeping it standing would have meant keeping a visible reminder of what had happened there. A palace like this is more than architecture. It is an arrangement of memory. The rooms once had names and purposes, reception spaces designed to host the political and financial elite, galleries meant to display a cultivated vision of Europe, private corridors that protected family life from public performance. When the Nazis seized Jewish property, they did not just take objects. They broke the continuity between people and place. The palace became an address without its owners, and its contents became inventory. After 1945, the question was not only whether certain objects could be returned. The deeper question was whether Vienna would permit the Rothschild presence to regain physical form in the city that had turned against it. Restitution in Austria unfolded as a long and often reluctant process. Some items were returned, some were not, and many were dispersed far beyond any simple path of recovery. Legal ownership could be restored on paper, while the lived world remained unrecoverable. In the Rothschild case, this gap produced a second kind of loss. Even when the family's rights were acknowledged, the conditions around those rights could still feel coercive. Post-war authorities controlled export permissions, and returned art could become entangled with pressure to donate works to Austrian institutions in exchange for permission to remove other pieces. The story did not end with liberation. It shifted into bureaucracy, negotiation, and compromise, an extension of power into peacetime forms.
Against that background, the palace itself became a problem. It was valuable land and an expensive building to maintain, but it was also a symbol that resisted easy repurposing. Turning it into a public museum would have required curating its meaning directly, explaining how the building had been seized, how its owners were targeted, and how its collections were dismantled. Transforming it into government offices would have asked civil servants to work daily inside a structure that represented state-enabled dispossession. Selling it into private hands would have created another controversy. Who would buy it, and what would they do with the history embedded in its walls? Demolition, by contrast, avoided these questions. It solved the practical problem and softened the moral one. It turned a contested landmark into an absence. Reports from the period describe a demolition that was anything but delicate. Elements of the building that could be salvaged were sold off, sometimes cheaply, and much was destroyed because the effort of careful preservation did not match the urgency of redevelopment. The palace had been built to last, with heavy construction that resisted easy dismantling. Bringing it down required force. The image that remains is not of a decayed ruin collapsing under its own weight, but of a deliberate act, peacetime dynamite where wartime bombs had not finished the job. Once the palace was gone, the story of what happened there became harder to grasp in physical terms. Without the building, it is difficult to convey scale. A photograph can show a facade, but not the feeling of distance created by a set-back courtyard and ironwork. An inventory can list a painting, but not the way it shaped the light and mood of a room. A floor plan can describe movement, but not the silence of an emptied corridor after a family's life has been removed. Demolition converts history into documentation. It forces the past to live in archives rather than streets.
And yet, Vienna still holds traces that sharpen the contrast. Other Rothschild-associated buildings in the city survived, including a palace on the same avenue that later served diplomatic functions. Their continued existence makes the disappearance of the Palais Albert Rothschild feel less like inevitability and more like a decision specific to this one address, an address too large, too famous, too burdened with meaning to be comfortably integrated into the post-war city. That is why the estate can be called forgotten without being unknown. Specialists, historians, and provenance researchers have never truly lost track of it. It appears in records, in restitution files, in the provenance notes that follow objects through decades of sales and museum catalogues. Every time a work of art is traced back to a Viennese seizure, the palace briefly reappears as a point of origin. A room once filled, then emptied, then erased. But for the everyday city, the estate has been absorbed into the modern landscape, leaving only a faint outline where memory should be. There is a personal dimension to this disappearance that is easy to miss when focusing on buildings. Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild lived through the transformation from respected Viennese magnate to hostage of a regime that treated his life as leverage. He saw the palace again after the war, standing but altered, and then he saw it removed from the city entirely. The timing is stark. Demolition in 1954, his death in 1955. A man who had been forced to surrender so much watched the most visible symbol of his family's Vienna existence disappear not under Nazi rule, but in the era that claimed to be rebuilding justice. What remains now is an absence that still does work. It prevents easy closure. A ruined palace can be romanticized, a demolished one cannot. A preserved palace can be toured, contextualized, and absorbed into civic pride. A vanished one insists on questions. Why was it easier to clear the site than to preserve the witness? Why did the city choose replacement over confrontation? How much of Vienna's post-war identity was built not only by restoring what could be rebuilt, but by removing what was too uncomfortable to keep standing? The mystery, in the end, is not hidden passages or sealed chambers. It is the way a city manages memory through architecture. The Palais Albert Rothschild was designed as permanence in stone, a dynastic seat for a family whose power did not come from a crown, but from influence, networks, and capital. It survived the war, and then it did not survive the peace. That is the final turn of the story. A palace strong enough to endure the violence of a regime, yet not strong enough to withstand the quiet decision of a post-war city to let it vanish. The address remains, the outline does not. And in that gap, the estate becomes what it was never meant to be, a question Vienna still has to live with, even when the building is gone.